The summer of 1939 was hotter than memory, but the heat rising from the pavements of Manhattan felt like the breath of something monstrous waiting just beyond the Atlantic. On the third floor of the King's Crown Hotel on West 116th Street, two Hungarian physicists paced a cramped room whose windows looked out toward the Hudson. Leo Szilard, stocky and chain-smoking, clutched a page of calculations that spelled out a chain reaction so violent it could level a city. Eugene Wigner, gaunt and precise, whispered the unthinkable. The Germans might already be building such a weapon. They needed a voice the world would hear. Albert Einstein, the gentle sage of Princeton, received them on the second day of August, wearing a white linen suit and sandals without socks. Szilard explained the neutron multiplication in halting English, but Einstein's eyes widened the moment he grasped the implication. Together, they drafted a letter to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, warning that extremely powerful bombs of a new type might soon become reality. Einstein signed, and the pages were rushed by courier to the White House. October brought bureaucratic silence. Roosevelt forms the Advisory Committee on Uranium, yet meetings drifted like smoke. Meanwhile, on the 1st of September, German tanks rolled into Poland. London declared war, and the radio carried the hollow voice of Neville Chamberlain promising peace no more. Across American campuses, refugee physicists listened with the particular dread of men who had already fled one inferno. Enrico Fermi, once of Rome, now of Columbia, measured neutron capture in a sub-basement beneath the football field. Leo Szilard haunted the same corridors, carrying graphite samples in his overcoat pockets like contraband secrets. In Berkeley, California, J. Robert Oppenheimer lectured on Sanskrit poetry in the morning and bombarded beryllium with deuterons in the afternoon. His gaunt frame, burning eyes, and delicate hands made him seem half monk, half hawk. Colleagues whispered about his left-wing friendships, his fundraising for Spanish refugees, his brilliance sharp enough to cut steel. Far away in Washington, an Army engineer named Leslie Groves stomped through the War Department halls, cursing delays in the construction of new barracks. A stout, bulldog man with a West Point ring and a hatred of red tape, Groves did not yet know that uranium would soon matter more than concrete. On the 7th of December 1941, the world tilted. Japanese planes screamed out of the Pacific sky, and the Arizona burned for 2 days. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy, and in laboratories from Chicago to Stanford, the slide rules began to click faster. Theoretical fear had become military necessity. Somewhere in the gathering dark, a secret city was about to be born on a mesa in New Mexico, and the scientists who would build the bomb that ended civilization's innocence began, unknowingly, to pack their bags. The Unseen Laboratory. September 1942. A brisk wind swept across the Potomac as Brigadier General Leslie Groves received orders that would change the course of human history. The Manhattan Engineer District needed a military commander, and Groves, fresh from building the Pentagon, was the Army's choice. Within days, he faced an even more crucial decision: finding the scientific director who would translate theoretical physics into apocalyptic reality. The general's search led him to J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist whose haunted eyes had already glimpsed the mathematical abyss. The Federal Bureau of Investigation objected strenuously. Oppenheimer's past associations with left-wing causes, his relationships with Communist Party members, his support for Spanish Republic forces. But Groves understood that genius often walked hand in hand with dangerous ideas. Site selection became an obsession. The ideal location needed isolation, abundant water, rail access, and most crucially, absolute secrecy. Los Alamos, a remote boys' school perched 8,000 feet above sea level, offered everything except comfort. In November 1942, Groves and Oppenheimer stood on that windswept plateau as construction crews dynamited ancient juniper groves. Barbed wire began to snake across the landscape like some metallic vine. The town materialized with impossible speed, prefabricated barracks rising overnight like mushrooms after rain. A post-exchange, hospital, and theater appeared as if conjured by some wartime sorcery. Scientists arrived in March 1943, their families told only that they were traveling to a post office box in Santa Fe. Security became absolute, a paranoid's paradise where every conversation was potentially recorded. Babies' birth certificates listed only P.O. Box 1663 as place of birth. The town's theater showed dusty cowboy reels, while equations covered napkins in the adjacent diner. Enrico Fermi arrived from Chicago, bringing secrets of the first controlled nuclear reaction. Leo Szilard's urgent warnings from 1939 now echoed through the mesa's thin air. Richard Feynman played bongo drums between calculations that would reshape physics itself. Hans Bethe led theoretical divisions through calculations that bridged the gap between equations and annihilation. Oppenheimer, increasingly gaunt, found solace in Sanskrit verses from the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Words that would haunt him forever. By spring 1944, the secret city hummed with purpose. Scientists worked 18-hour days, their families living in a strange limbo between academic community and military encampment. Every equation brought them closer to a threshold no human had crossed. The race against Nazi Germany had become a race against physics itself. December 2nd, 1942. A wind knifes across the midway at the University of Chicago, rattling the bare branches above the abandoned football stadium known as Stagg Field. Beneath those stands, in a squash court whose walls still echo the cheers of long-forgotten games, Enrico Fermi stands before a 20-foot mound of graphite bricks laced with dark uranium slugs. His team, Leo Szilard, Walter Zinn, Herbert Anderson, move like monks at Vespers, setting the final bricks in place. The Geiger counter ticks softly, almost politely, waiting for history to begin. At 3:25 in the afternoon, Fermi gives the order. The cadmium rod, poisoned to neutrons, withdraws inch by inch. The chatter accelerates, faster, faster, until it steadies into a roar that is somehow both mechanical and alive. For 28 minutes, Chicago Pile 1 sustains the world's first self-sustaining nuclear reaction. No explosion, no mushroom cloud, just the quiet hum of a new force unchained. Fermi shuts it down with a second rod, and the counter falls silent. The atomic age has begun. Word races east to General Leslie Groves, who within days orders 3 secret cities conjured from wilderness and wartime urgency. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, will spin uranium until it sings in a higher key. Hanford, Washington, will breed plutonium in reactors beside the Columbia River, and Los Alamos, New Mexico, perched on a mesa reachable only by hairpin road, will design the weapon itself. The uranium path begins in the Belgian Congo, where ore is hacked from the Shinko Lobwe mine under equatorial sun. Shipped in sealed drums marked only with code numbers, the ore crosses the Atlantic under naval escort. In New York, it is refined into uranium oxide so secret that even the refinery workers do not know what they handle. Then, by overnight express, it travels to Tennessee, where calatrons, giant electromagnetic separators, hum like beehives the size of apartment blocks. Inside each tank, uranium hexafluoride gas swirls. Lighter isotopes nudge toward one exit, heavier toward another, until the rare U-235 is concentrated to lethal purity. Meanwhile, on the mesa, Robert Oppenheimer recruits the brightest minds in theoretical physics. Among them, 24-year-old Richard Feynman, who arrives with a suitcase, a slide rule, and a habit of cracking safes for sport. Nights drop below freezing. The laboratory's heating fails as often as not. Feynman wraps himself in a blanket, scribbling neutron diffusion equations by candlelight, the scratch of pencil the only sound until the generators rumble back to life. Tension coils tighter each week. Intelligence from Switzerland whispers that Werner Heisenberg's team in Leipzig may have already achieved a chain reaction. If the Nazis cracked the atom first, London could vanish in a flash. Groves orders round-the-clock shifts. Coffee arrives by the crate, cigarettes by the carton. Every hour, every calculation is weighed against the unthinkable alternative. By spring of 1944, Oak Ridge has enriched enough uranium for one bomb, if the designs hold. Hanford's reactors glow like captured suns along the river, their plutonium destined for a second weapon. And on the mesa, Feynman and Hans Bethe perfect the equations that will compress a sphere of metal into a star for 1/1,000,000th of a second. They do not yet know that their device will not just end a war, it will end the long innocence of a species. The chain reaction begun beneath Stagfield has already jumped from graphite to history, and nothing will ever be the same. The winter of 1943 pressed against the high mesas of New Mexico like a clenched fist. In the drafty barracks that now served as dormitories, physicists shivered over slide rules while the wind rattled the panes with a sound like distant artillery. They had every reason to shiver beyond the cold. Across the Atlantic, deep in the pine-dark heart of the Black Forest, Allied agents had confirmed a nightmare. The German Uraneinfernen, literally Uranium Club, was no rumor. The report reached General Leslie Groves on a brittle December morning, delivered by courier who would not speak above a whisper. Groves read the single page, then read it again. "They are months, not years behind us," he muttered. Within 24 hours, he had signed Operation Alsos into existence, Greek for Grove, a sardonic nod from military intelligence. Their mission: follow the advancing Allied armies, seize every laboratory, every gram of uranium, every mind that might know how to turn matter into sunfire. Back in Los Alamos, the news hit the mess hall like a dropped tray. Oppenheimer climbed onto a bench and raised his voice above the clatter. "The Reich may have a weapon before we do," he said. 18-hour days start tonight. Compartmentalization became a religion. A metallurgist shaping plutonium hemispheres was forbidden to ask the chemist next door what those hemispheres were for. Hans Bethe's theoretical division worked behind locked doors marked only with a single letter, T. They wrestled with a devilish problem. Plutonium, cooked in the piles at Hanford, fizzed with spontaneous neutrons like a shaken soda. A simple gun-type assembly, reliable for uranium, would blow itself apart before the core achieved full compression. The only hope lay in a perfect spherical implosion, an inward-moving lens of explosives squeezing plutonium so fast and so evenly that even its own restlessness could not escape. No one had ever built such a lens. No one had ever tested it. Richard Feynman, still boyish at 26, stayed up past 3 a.m, coaxing numbers from his marchant, cigarette ash drifting onto the keys. He would later recall that the equations themselves seemed to sweat. While the physicists pushed matter to its limits, another chain reaction, this one of secrets, slipped through the barbed wire. Klaus Fuchs, a quiet theoretician who had fled Nazi persecution, was also a Soviet courier. Under the codename Brest, he photographed blueprints in a bathroom stall and passed them to a cutout on the Santa Fe Trail. Moscow received its first detailed sketch of an implosion lens on the same day that Groves ordered the first plutonium core cast. Morale cratered in February 1944 when V-2 rockets began hammering London. Each explosion carried the unspoken question, what if the next warhead carried not high explosive, but the heart of a star? Letters from worried wives arrived stained with soot and fear. Groves responded with ruthless speed. He ordered the plutonium casting furnaces at Los Alamos to run day and night. their electric arcs painting the canyon walls violet and white. The deadline, a workable core by July 1945, ready to ride beneath a B-29 into the sky over Japan, unless Berlin beat them to the punch. At the weekly colloquium in March, Oppenheimer stood beneath the single bare bulb of the lecture hall. His voice was almost gentle, yet it carried like a gunshot in the silence. "We may be only weeks ahead of the Nazis," he said. "Every hour we lose is measured in lives we cannot yet count." Outside, the desert wind scoured the mesas, carrying away the chalk dust and the sleepless laughter and the soft, persistent ticking of unseen Geiger counters. The race against the Reich had become a race against time itself, and the finish line was the first light of a new kind of dawn. Spring 1945 arrived on the high plateau like a held breath. Through the Sangre de Cristo passes came the first shipment of plutonium, its lead-lined casket lashed inside an armored sedan, guards cradling Thompson submachine guns. In Technical Area 55, the metallurgists donned asbestos aprons and dark goggles, then poured the grapefruit-sized plutonium sphere into a silver crucible heated to 1,200 degrees. When the metal cooled, it gleamed with an eerie lavender sheen, heavier than gold, warm to the touch from its own invisible heartbeat of radioactivity. Richard Feynman prowled the assembly halls like an impatient orchestra conductor, directing teams of Women's Army Corps technicians armed with jeweler's screwdrivers. Each lens, a perfect truncated octahedron of fast and slow explosives, had to nest against its neighbor with tolerances thinner than a human hair. One speck of dust, one uneven plane, and the implosion wave would warp. The plutonium pit would squirt rather than compress. The gadget would fizzle into a radioactive ember. Every detonator, 32 in all, had to fire within 1 microsecond of its brothers. Otherwise, the sphere would tear itself apart before the chain reaction reached completion. General Leslie Groves arrived unannounced one April morning, boots still dusty from the Trinity site survey in the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. He demanded a full-scale test by mid-July. No delays, no excuses. The desert already chosen for its flatness, its distance from prying eyes, its biblical emptiness. Jason Prebolo. Robert Oppenheimer christened the trial Trinity, lifting the word from John Donne's tortured plea, "Batter my heart, three-person God," though he told no one the private reason. By night, he wandered the perimeter fence, reciting Sanskrit under his breath, calculating blast yields, and more quietly, the moral weight of what they were about to loose upon the world. Yet even as the plutonium core took its final polish, dissent stirred in the barracks. Leo Szilard, the same man who had warned Roosevelt 5 years earlier, drafted a petition urging a demonstration on an uninhabited target before any military use. Enrico Fermi and Hans Bethe added their names, arguing that dropping the weapon without warning risked opening an age of terror. Groves dismissed the appeal out of hand, citing secrecy, the need to end the war swiftly, and the stark calculus that the invasion of Japan would cost 1 million American lives. And so the assembly continued. The core, now christened the Gadget, slid into its nickel-steel shell like a seed into an iron fruit. Layer upon layer of explosive lenses followed, each numbered, each weighed to the milligram, until the bomb looked less like a weapon than a geometric puzzle of terrifying symmetry. By the first week of July, the device was ready for the journey south, its cradle bolted inside an army ambulance painted white to deflect desert heat. As the convoy rolled out, dawn light caught on the windshield of the lead sedan, and for a moment the entire mesa seemed to pause, as if the plateau itself were exhale. Behind them, the secret city fell quiet. Laboratories locked, Geiger counters ticking softly in the empty corridors, the air still smelling of solder and ozone, and something metallic that could not be named. The race against the Reich had ended months ago in a Berlin bunker. Now the race was against the rising sun of a new age, whose light none of them could truly foresee. July 15, 1945. A bruised sky hangs over the Jornada del Muerto desert, lightning forking down like the fingers of an angry god. General Leslie Groves paces inside the weather station, his boots echoing on wooden planks, watching the Geiger counters dance nervously with each thunderclap. The Gadget sits in its steel cradle at Ground Zero, 20 miles south, wrapped in explosive lenses that fear electricity more than any man. Groves considers postponement, but meteorologist Jack Hubbard points to his charts. Clearing by dawn, he promises. The storm will pass like a nightmare at sunrise. At 3:30 a.m., the convoy begins its slow crawl south through the mud, scientists in sealed buses unable to see the desert they had memorized in daylight. 20 miles north of Ground Zero, the bunker hunches like a concrete beast, its slit windows facing the ultimate sunrise. J. Fativua. Robert Oppenheimer stands apart from the others, chain smoking in the sheltered doorway, his hollow cheeks illuminated by each match flare. Beside him, General Groves checks his pocket watch every 30 seconds, the minute hand crawling toward destiny like a wounded insect. In the control bunker, 20-year-old Richard Feynman grips the timing switches, his knuckles white against the bakelite handles that will unleash hell itself. The countdown begins at 5:10, voices crackling through field telephones, each second stretching into infinity. At 5:29 and 45 seconds, the world holds its breath. Then, light. Not light as mortals know it, but the very furnace of stars torn open at the Earth's surface. The steel tower vanishes into vapor before the sound arrives, 20,000 tons of metal becoming memory in less time than a heartbeat. A violet mushroom cloud climbs 7 miles high, its cap spreading like the wings of some impossible angel. At 10,000 yards, scientists feel heat like opening an oven door to the surface of the sun. Shadows of human bones appear etched onto distant rocks, X-ray flashes burning skeletons into stone. Oppenheimer's lips move, barely audible above the cosmic thunder. I am become death, destroyer of worlds. Hans Bethe stands transfixed, his slide rule falling forgotten to the bunker floor. Geiger counters scream their electronic song, radiation spiking beyond calibration. General Groves barks orders to fly journalists in under strictest embargo. The world must not know yet. Within hours, a coded cable reaches President Truman at Potsdam. Operated on this morning. Diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. In the Berlin suburb of Potsdam, Harry Truman reads the message twice, then sets it carefully beside his morning coffee. The age of nuclear weapons is born in silence and awe. Civilization's innocence vaporized like the tower at Trinity. Behind them, the secret city of Los Alamos sleeps on, unknowing that their creation has opened a door that can never again be closed. The fireball that froze time has become the sun that will never set, burning now in the collective memory of humankind forever. The dawn of August 6, 1945, broke over the Pacific with a quiet that felt almost conspiratorial. Aboard the Enola Gay, Colonel Paul Tibbets checked his watch one last time as the uranium bomb called Little Boy sat cradled in the modified bomb bay like a sleeping demon. 3 hours later, at exactly 8:15 in the morning Hiroshima time, the city spread below them like a child's toy village. Tibbets banked left, the bomb doors opened with a mechanical whisper, and Little Boy began its 43-second descent. When the uranium reached critical mass, 43 seconds later, the sky itself seemed to tear open. 80,000 human beings simply ceased to exist in that first terrible instant. Their shadows burned forever into walls and pavement. 3 days later, the plutonium bomb called Fat Man followed its sister into history. At 11:02 in the morning, Nagasaki's Urakami Valley became ground zero for the second sun humanity had learned to summon. Back in Los Alamos, The celebrations were anything but triumphant. Some physicists wept openly, their faces buried in their hands. Others vomited into waste bins, their bodies rejecting the terrible knowledge of what they had wrought. Robert Oppenheimer stood alone on the mesa, watching the sunset that looked too much like the fireball they had created. When he met President Truman weeks later in Washington, his voice barely rose above a whisper. "Mr. President, I feel we have blood on our hands," he said. The newspapers called them heroes, but inside the fences of Los Alamos, the physicists drafted urgent statements about international atomic control. General Groves began the slow process of dissolving the Manhattan Project in December 1946, but everyone knew the genie could never be returned to its bottle. When the gates of the secret city finally swung open, its residents carried invisible chains heavier than any physical burden. A young Richard Feynman wrote to his wife from this threshold moment, his pen shaking slightly as he formed the words. "We ended the war," he wrote, "but perhaps we ended much more. The mushroom cloud had become humanity's new sun, burning forever in the collective memory of mankind. As Los Alamos emptied and its secrets scattered to the winds, the world awakened beneath a shadow no generation would ever escape." The fireball that froze time had become the eternal flame of our nuclear age, lighting a path forward that would never again know true darkness, only the constant glow of potential annihilation. The ashes of innocence settled across the world like nuclear winter snow, and the men who built the first weapon of mass destruction found themselves transformed from warriors to witnesses. On August 1st, 1946, President Truman signed the Atomic Energy Act, transferring the terrible knowledge from General Groves' military hands to the newly formed Civilian Atomic Energy Commission. Los Alamos, once the most secret place on Earth, became a permanent national laboratory, its barbed wire replaced by the illusion of openness. The veterans of the Manhattan Project scattered like particles in an atomic chain reaction. Some returned to universities where chalkboards replaced blueprints, teaching students who would never know the weight of creating weapons that could end worlds. Others faced congressional hearings, their wartime heroism questioned by politicians who understood nothing of what they'd witnessed. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who had spoken Sanskrit verses at the first nuclear test, now walked the corridors of power as a national hero. Yet his conscience had already begun to turn against the monster he helped create. When the hydrogen bomb program began, the father of the atomic age became its most eloquent opponent. In 1954, his security clearance was revoked, the government he served turning against the man who had given them the ultimate power. Richard Feynman, the young physicist who had laughed at safes and played bongos in the desert, turned his brilliant mind to quantum electrodynamics. But at night, fireballs still bloomed behind his eyelids, and he would wake screaming from dreams where the equations became mushroom clouds. Leo Szilard, the Hungarian physicist who had first conceived the chain reaction, spent his remaining years campaigning for arms control. He died in 1964, still fighting the weapon he had helped unleash. General Leslie Groves retired to a private engineering firm, forever bound by oaths of secrecy. He never spoke of what he knew, carrying the burden of having directed history's most devastating project. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha, the explosion-affected people, carried their scars like living monuments. Children born years after the blasts faced discrimination, their parents' radiation exposure marking them as somehow unclean. The United Nations debated nuclear disarmament while the United States and Soviet Union stockpiled thousands of warheads, each capable of destroying civilization. Today, Los Alamos exists as both laboratory and museum. Tourists pose beside Fat Man's empty casing, smiling for photographs with the shell of a weapon that killed 80,000 people. At sunset over Bandelier National Monument, ancient cliff dwellings carved by the Anasazi people 800 years ago remind us that every civilization must decide what knowledge it will wield and at what cost.
The fireball that froze time has become the eternal flame of our nuclear age, burning forever in the collective memory of mankind.